The morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling market of Wagadugu as President Ibrahim Traoré moved quietly through the crowd. He had dismissed his security detail an hour earlier, seeking the authentic pulse of his people's daily struggles. Vendors called out prices for tomatoes and millet, their voices mixing with the rhythmic pounding of mortars and pestles. The air was thick with dust and the aroma of grilled meat from nearby stalls. Children darted between adults' legs, their laughter cutting through the commercial symphony. Trier paused at a fabric vendor stall, running his fingers across the vibrant patterns that told stories of Burkina Faso's rich heritage. A commotion erupted near the grain merchant's corner, where an agitated man argued loudly with the seller. His clothes were torn and dirty, his eyes darting nervously across the crowd as if searching for escape routes. The merchant stepped back, fear creeping across his weathered face as other vendors began to whisper and point. Women gathered their children closer, sensing the tension that now electrified the morning air. The man's hand kept reaching toward something concealed beneath his faded jacket. His desperation was palpable, radiating through the marketplace like heat from the scorching Sahel sun. Traoré felt the shift in atmosphere before he saw the source. His instincts honed by years of military service, he moved closer, not away, drawn by a leader's responsibility to understand his people's struggles. The crowd began to thin as vendors recognized the dangerous energy emanating from the stranger. Market women clutched their goods tighter while men positioned themselves between the disturbance and their families. The usual bargaining and laughter fell silent, replaced by an ominous tension. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. As their eyes met across the dusty ground, time seemed suspended in the sweltering heat. The fugitive's face registered shock, then a mixture of opportunity and despair that chilled even the boldest onlookers. Traoré stood, firm, his calm presence contrasting sharply with the chaos brewing around. This was no ordinary market dispute, but a moment that would test everything he believed about leadership and compassion. The stage was set for an encounter that would shock a nation. Neither man yet knew how profoundly this moment would change both their lives forever. Amadu Sankara had once been a respected teacher in a village school outside Bob de Lasso, his life dedicated to educating the next generation. 3 months ago, his world collapsed when armed militants raided his community, demanding tribute money that the impoverished village couldn't provide. They burned the school, killed the village chief, and when Amadu tried to protect his students, they murdered his wife in front of him. The trauma shattered his mind, transforming the gentle educator into a man consumed by rage and grief. He blamed the government for failing to protect rural communities from the terror that plagued the Sahel. In his broken state, he convinced himself that President Traoré was responsible for every innocent life lost to violence. For weeks, he had lived like a ghost in the wilderness, surviving on wild fruits and occasional charity from sympathetic farmers. The authorities labeled him a fugitive after he attacked a government convoy, believing it contained officials who had abandoned his village. His face appeared on wanted posters throughout the country, branded as a terrorist. Sympathizer despite his true story. Sleep brought nightmares of his wife's final moments, while waking hours were filled with visions of revenge. The gun he now carried had belonged to one of the militants he'd killed in a desperate act of vengeance. Each day his sanity slipped further away as he plotted to confront the man he held responsible for his suffering. The market had been his target because intelligence suggested Traoré sometimes visited without heavy security, connecting with ordinary citizens. Amadu had waited 3 days, sleeping in doorways and begging for scraps while watching for his opportunity. His plan was simple but desperate: force a confrontation that would expose what he saw as the president's failures. The grain merchant had recognized him from the wanted posters, refusing to sell him food and threatening to call authorities. Panic had set in as he realized his cover was blown in his Chance might be slipping away. The weight of the pistol against his ribs felt like his only remaining connection to purpose. Now face to face with Ibrahim Traoré, all is rehearsed. Speeches and accusations seemed to evaporate in the scorching air. This wasn't the distant politician he had imagined, but a man who looked directly into his eyes with curious concern, rather than fear. The president appeared younger than in official photographs, his presence radiating a calm strength that momentarily confused Amadu's rage, clouded mind. Around them, the market buzzed with growing tension as more people recognized both men and understood the gravity of the moment. Amadu's hand trembled as it moved toward the concealed weapon, his last desperate act to make someone pay for his unbearable loss. The teacher who had once inspired children to dream now stood ready to destroy everything in pursuit of his twisted justice. The metallic glint caught the sunlight as Amadu's trembling hand emerged from beneath his jacket, the pistol's barrel, reflecting the horror in nearby faces. Market women screamed and grabbed their children, overturning baskets of grain and vegetables in their frantic rush to escape. Vendors dug behind their wooden stalls while others froze in terror, unable to process the surreal scene unfolding before them. The weapon wavered in Amadu's unsteady grip, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger as sweat dripped from his brow. Men shouted warnings to each other while positioning themselves as human shields for their families. The bustling marketplace transformed into a scene of chaos within seconds, dust clouds rising from trampling feet. You destroyed everything. Amadu's voice cracked with raw emotion, the gun now pointed directly at President Traoré's chest. His eyes burned with tears of rage and desperation as he struggled to maintain his aim despite his shaking hands. The weight of his grief seemed to pull him forward, while fear held him back, creating a terrible internal battle. Around them, the circle of onlookers grew wider as people backed away, but none dared to run completely. Some pulled out phones to record, while others whispered prayers in local languages. The silence between the two men became deafening against a backdrop of distant panic. Ibrahim Traoré stood perfectly still, his hands visible and open at his sides, showing no sign of fear or aggression. His calm breathing contrasted sharply with Amadu's ragged gasps and a collective terror surrounding them both. Years of military training had taught him to read desperate men, and he recognized pain rather than pure malice in his attacker's eyes. The president's security detail would arrive soon, but he knew that any sudden movement could trigger violence that would haunt this community forever. Instead of stepping back, he took one small step forward, his voice steady and clear when he finally spoke. His courage in the face of death sent ripples of amazement through the crowd. The gun's barrel seemed to grow heavier in Amadu's grip as he stared into the face of the man he had blamed for everything. This wasn't the cold politician he had imagined, but someone who looked at him with what almost seemed like understanding. The president's unexpected composure began to crack through his wall of rage, introducing doubt into his carefully constructed narrative of revenge. Behind them, someone began reciting verses from the Quran, while others joined in Christian prayers, their voices creating a haunting chorus. The moment stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap in either direction based on the next word spoken. History held its breath as two men from different worlds faced each other across an ocean of pain. I can see your pain, brother. Traoré's voice cut through the tension like a gentle breeze across the Sahel plains. His eyes never left Amadu's face, reading the anguish behind the fury with the intuition of someone who had witnessed countless tragedies. The president's military bearing remained evident, but it was tempered by a compassion that surprised even the closest observers. He recognized the hollow look of a man who had lost everything, having seen it in refugee camps and devastated villages throughout his rise to power. His hands remained open, palms facing outward in a gesture of non-aggression that spoke louder than any words. The crowd watched in stunned silence as their leader chose dialogue over dominance in the face of mortal danger. Tell me about the fire in your heart. Traoré continued, his voice carrying the authority of leadership without the coldness of politics. He had learned during his military years that desperate men needed to be heard before they could be healed or stopped. The president's posture shifted slightly, becoming less formal and more human, as if he was speaking to a troubled friend rather than an armed assailant. Around them, the market had fallen into an eerie quiet, with only the distant sound of crying children and whispered prayers breaking the silence. Vendors and customers alike seemed mesmerized by the unprecedented scene of their president refusing to retreat from danger. Even the grain merchant, who had recognized Amadu, now watched with growing amazement at Traoré's courage. The gun in Amadu's hand began to waver as confusion replaced some of his rage, the president's unexpected response disrupting his carefully planned confrontation. Traoré noticed the slight drop in the weapon's angle and took it as a sign to continue building this fragile bridge of communication. His experience negotiating with various militant groups had taught him that violence often masked deeper wounds that needed acknowledgement before healing could begin. The sun beat down mercilessly on both men, sweat mixing, with tears on Amadu's face while the president remained steady as stone. Market women peered from behind overturned stalls, their initial terror slowly transforming into fascination at witnessing such unprecedented leadership. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between tragedy and something entirely unexpected. "I know you have lost someone precious," Traoré said softly, his words carrying the weight of personal understanding that only came from shared suffering. The president had buried friends, comrades, and civilians during his own journey through conflict, and he recognized the particular grief of a man seeking someone to blame. His calm demeanor began to have a subtle effect on the surrounding crowd, some of whom started inching closer rather than continuing to flee. Amadu's breathing became less erratic as the president's steady presence created an island of relative calm in the chaos of the marketplace. The weapon remained pointed at Traoré, but its grip seemed less certain than moments before. Something in the president's eyes suggested he saw not an enemy, but a fellow human being drowning in loss. They came at dawn. Amadu's voice broke like a dam bursting, years of suppressed anguish pouring out in a torrent of words. His grip on the pistol loosened slightly as memories overwhelmed his present rage, transporting him back to that terrible morning in his village. The president listened intently, his steady gaze encouraging the broken man to continue sharing his unbearable burden with someone who might finally understand. Around them, the market crowd leaned in, despite their fear, drawn by the raw humanity of a man's ultimate suffering being laid bare. Tears mixed with sweat on Amadu's weathered cheeks as he relived the nightmare that had destroyed his world. The gun remained pointed at Traoré, but it now seemed more like a prop in a tragic performance than an instrument of imminent violence. "My wife, she taught the youngest children their letters," he continued, his voice cracking with each word as the pistol trembled in his weakening grasp. The image of his beloved Fatima filled his mind, her gentle smile as she helped struggling students learn to write their names in Arabic script. Traoré's expression softened further as he recognized the depth of loss that had driven this man to such desperate measures. The crowd fell completely silent now, even the children sensing the sacred nature of grief being shared in their midst. Market vendors who, moments before had feared for their lives, now found themselves moved by the profound tragedy unfolding before them. The president nodded slowly, acknowledging each painful detail as if honoring the memory of a woman he had never met. "Where was the army when the terrorists burned our school?" Amadu demanded, his accusation hanging in the air like smoke from the destroyed classroom he could never forget. His anger rekindled briefly, but it lacked the pure fury of moments before, tempered now by the cathartic release of finally being heard. The president accepted the accusation without defensive protest, understanding that this man's rage was born from a systemic failure that went beyond any individual's control. Onlookers began to murmur among themselves, recognizing their own fears and frustrations in Amadu's words about government protection failing rural communities. The weapon wavered between threat and plea as its holders struggled between revenge and the human need for acknowledgement. Traoré remained motionless, allowing the man's pain to fill the space between them without trying to justify or deflect. I became a ghost after that day, Amadu whispered, his confession carrying the weight of 3 months spent wandering in a wilderness of grief and rage. The president saw clearly now how a respected teacher had been transformed into a wanted fugitive through circumstances that could have broken any man. His steady presence continued to provide an anchor for Amadu's emotional storm, creating space for truth that the broken man had never been able to share. The market crowd witnessed not just a confrontation, but the unveiling of a tragedy that represented countless untold stories across their troubled nation. The gun now seemed almost forgotten in Amadu's hand as he stared into the eyes of the man he had blamed for everything. Something profound was shifting in the space between them, visible to all who watched this unprecedented moment of human connection. Amadu Sankara, Traoré, repeated the name softly, his eyes widening with sudden recognition that sent a ripple through the watching crowd. The president's composed demeanor cracked for the first time, revealing a flash of deep personal pain that mirrored Amadu's own suffering. He reached slowly into his shirt pocket, producing a weathered photograph that he held up with trembling fingers for the gunman to see. The image showed a young woman in teacher's robes, standing beside a group of uniformed soldiers, her radiant smile illuminating faces. Hardened by conflict, Amadu's weapon dropped several inches as shock replaced rage, his mind struggling to process this impossible connection to his murdered wife. The market fell into absolute silence as both men stared at the photograph that bridged their separate worlds of grief. She saved my unit during an ambush near Jibwa 3 years ago. Traoré's voice carried the weight of profound gratitude mixed with fresh sorrow. His words painted a picture of Fatima treating wounded soldiers in her village clinic, refusing payment and working through the night to save lives. The president described her gentle hands cleaning bullet wounds and her soft voice comforting dying men far from their families. Amadu's grip on the pistol went completely slack as he listened to his beloved wife being honored by the man he had come to kill. Tears streamed down both their faces as the cruel irony of fate revealed itself to the stunned marketplace audience. The woman whose death had driven Amadu to seek revenge had once been an angel of mercy to the very man he blamed. She spoke of her husband, the teacher, how proud she was of his dedication to the children. Traoré continued, his memories bringing Fatima's spirit alive in the dusty market square. The president recalled her worried conversations about rising violence in remote villages and her fears for her husband's safety when schools became targets. Amadu collapsed to his knees, the weapon falling harmlessly to the ground as the full weight of this revelation crashed over him like a dam breaking. Around them, market women began to weep openly, understanding that they were witnessing something far more profound than a simple confrontation. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the sacred nature of grief being transformed into something approaching grace. Even hardened men wiped away tears as they watched two souls connected by love for the same extraordinary woman. The president knelt beside the broken man, placing a gentle hand on Amadu's shoulder as both mourned the loss of someone who had touched their lives so deeply. In that moment, the wanted fugitive and the nation's leader became simply two men united by shared love and loss, their connection transcending politics and violence. The photograph lay between them on the dusty ground, Fatima's smile seeming to bless this impossible moment of human understanding. Market vendors began to step forward, no longer afraid, but moved to witness this transformation of hatred into healing. The gun lay forgotten as both men honored the memory of a woman whose life had been dedicated to bringing people together. The crowd realized they were witnessing not just the end of a confrontation, but the birth of something resembling redemption. The market women were the first to break their maternal instincts, recognizing the sacred nature of shared grief unfolding before them. Aisha, a fabric seller who had initially fled in terror, now stepped forward with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her voice rose in a traditional mourning song for Fatima, a woman she had never met, but whose story now lived in her heart. But the women joined the haunting melody, their voices creating a chorus that honored both love and loss in the ancient way of their people. Young mothers clutched their children closer, understanding how easily their own worlds could shatter like Amethyst had. The fear that had dominated moments before transformed into something deeper, a collective recognition of human fragility and strength. The men of the market, who had positioned themselves as protectors against perceived danger, now found themselves witnesses to an extraordinary display of leadership and compassion. Old Buri, a grain merchant who had lived through coups and conflicts, shook his head in amazement at what he was seeing. In 40 years, I have never witnessed such courage, he whispered to his neighbor, his voice thick with emotion. Younger men pulled out their phones, not a call for help, but to record this moment of profound human connection for their children to see. The vendors who had cowered behind their stalls now stood openly, drawn forward by the magnetic power of authentic reconciliation. Their whispered conversations carried notes of wonder at their president's refusal to respond to threat with force. Children peered around their parents' legs, sensing that something important was happening, even if they couldn't fully understand the adult complexities of politics and pain. Their innocent eyes witnessed their leader kneeling in the dust, treating a desperate man not as an enemy, but as a brother in suffering. Some of the older children began to inch closer, their natural curiosity overcoming learned caution as they observed this unprecedented scene. Teachers among the crowd recognized a profound educational moment unfolding. A lesson about leadership, forgiveness, and the power of human connection that no classroom could provide. The youngest one stopped crying, mesmerized by the sudden calm that had replaced chaos in their familiar marketplace. Their presence reminded all the adults of what was truly at stake in moments of crisis and choice. The transformation rippled outward to the gathered crowd like water flowing across parched earth after the first rains. Shopkeepers who had scrambled for cover now stood in respectful silence, understanding they were witnessing history being written in dust and tears. The circle around the two kneeling men tightened with reverence rather than fear, creating a protective barrier of human compassion around this sacred moment. Strangers reached for each other's hands, united by the shared experience of watching hatred dissolve into understanding. The market that had been a scene of terror minutes before now pulsed with hope that seemed to emanate from the connection between president and fugitive. Everyone present understood they would carry this story for the rest of their lives, a testament to the possibility of healing even in the most broken circumstances. President Traoré slowly reached for the fallen pistol, his movements deliberate and calm as hundreds of eyes watched his every gesture. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, not from its physical weight, but from the symbolic power it represented in this transformative moment. He could have easily secured it, called for a security detail, and had Amadu arrested as protocol demanded of any leader facing an assassination attempt. Instead, he carefully ejected the magazine and cleared the chamber, his military training evident in his precise handling of the firearm. The metallic sounds of disarmament echoed through the silent marketplace like a ceremonial bell, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Every person present understood they were witnessing a choice that would define not just this moment, but the character of their nation's leadership. With the weapon rendered harmless, Traoré did something that stunned even his most ardent supporters. He placed the empty pistol back into Amadu's trembling hands. A teacher's hands should hold books, not bullets, he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of profound understanding and forgiveness. The crowd gasped collectively, unable to comprehend their leader's decision to return a weapon to the man who had just threatened his life. Amadu stared at the pistol in disbelief, his mind struggling to process this act of trust that contradicted everything he thought he knew about power and politics. Market vendors exchanged incredulous glances, wondering if their president had lost his mind or found something deeper than conventional wisdom. The empty weapon in Amadu's hands became a symbol of redemption rather than destruction, its bullets replaced by the possibility of healing. "You have a choice, brother," Traoré continued, his voice steady but filled with compassion as he looked directly into Amadu's confused eyes. The president explained that the path of vengeance would only create more orphans and widows like those Fatima had died, trying to protect. He offered Amadu something no one expected, not punishment, but purpose, inviting him to help build the schools and security that could prevent future tragedies. The broken teacher's tears flowed freely as he realized he stood at a crossroads between destroying everything and honoring his wife's memory through reconstruction. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath, understanding that this moment would echo through generations of Burkina Faso history. The weight of choice pressed down on Amadu like the scorching Sahel sun, demanding a decision that would define the rest of his life. Amadu looked at the harmless weapon in his hands, then at the photograph of his beloved Fatima lying in the dust between them. Her smile seemed to speak to him across the veil of death, reminding him of the values they had shared and the children they had hoped to inspire together. The rage that consumed him for months began to crack like a dam under pressure, allowing other emotions, love, hope, purpose, to flow back into his wounded heart. He slowly placed the empty pistol on the ground and reached for the photograph, cradling it against his chest like a prayer. The marketplace erupted in amazed murmurs as witnesses realized they had just seen hatred transformed into healing through the simple but profound power of human understanding. This was the moment everyone would remember, not when a gun was drawn, but when it was willingly laid down in favor of something infinitely more powerful. "Stand up, Professor Sankara," Traoré said, using the respectful title as he extended his hand to help Amadu rise from the dusty ground. The crowd watched in amazement as their president lifted the man who had threatened his life just minutes before, treating him not as a criminal, but as a fellow citizen deserving of dignity. Amadu's legs shook as he stood, overwhelmed by the kindness he had never expected to receive from the man he had blamed for everything. The marketplace buzzed with whispered conversations as people tried to process this unprecedented display of leadership that defied every expectation about power and punishment. Old women nodded approvingly, recognizing the ancient African wisdom of restorative rather than retributive justice being practiced before their eyes. The morning sun seemed brighter now, casting new light on faces that had been marked by fear and now showed wonder and hope. "Your village needs rebuilding and our children need teachers," the president continued, his words carrying the authority of someone who understood that true justice involved healing rather than mere punishment. He spoke of establishing a new teacher training program in Fatima's memory, offering Amadu the chance to honor his wife's legacy by educating the next generation of Burkina Faso leaders. The crowd listened intently as Traoré outlined his vision of transforming tragedy into triumph through education and community reconstruction. Amadu's tears flowed freely as he realized he was being offered not just forgiveness, but purpose and a path back to man Fatima had loved and believed in. Market vendor began to smile through their own tears, understanding that they were witnessing leadership that embodied the best of African traditions of Ubuntu and collective healing. The transformation from confrontation to collaboration felt like watching a miracle unfold in their familiar neighborhood marketplace. But first, you must turn yourself in and face the legal process, Traoré added, gently, ensuring that compassion did not override the rule of law that held their society together. His words reminded everyone that true justice required accountability alongside mercy, and that healing could not begin without acknowledging the harm that had been caused. Amadu nodded solemnly, understanding that redemption required him to take responsibility for the path his grief had led him down. The President promised to personally oversee his case, ensuring fair treatment while he awaited trial and the opportunity to rebuild his life through service. Surrounding citizens murmured their approval, seeing wisdom in leadership that balanced forgiveness with the need for social order. The moment felt pregnant with possibility as two men who had been enemies minutes before now stood together as partners in the work of national healing. As if responding to some silent signal, the crowd began to part, creating a pathway that led away from the marketplace toward the nearby police station. Amadu walked beside President Traoré, no longer as fugitive and target, but as two men united by love for the same extraordinary woman and commitment to the same struggling nation. Market women threw flower petals from their stalls, turning what could have been a perp walk into something resembling a procession of reconciliation. Children followed at a respectful distance, their young minds absorbing lessons about leadership, forgiveness, and the power of choosing healing over hatred. The empty pistol remained forgotten in the dust, a discarded symbol of violence. Overwhelmed by the greater force of human compassion and wisdom, history would remember this day, not for the gun that was drawn, but for the choice to lay it down in favor of something infinitely more powerful. 6 months later, the Fatima Sankara Memorial School stood proudly in a rebuilt village where tragedy had first struck, its bright yellow walls reflecting the golden Sahel sunrise. Professor Amadu stood before his first class of eager students, his voice steady and warm as he taught them about the heroes and heroines of African independence movements. The wanted posters bearing his desperate face had been replaced by photographs of him receiving a presidential pardon and educational appointment ceremony. His students hung on every word, knowing their teacher had walked through darkness and emerged with wisdom that could only come from profound loss and unexpected redemption. The classroom buzzed with the energy of young minds discovering their potential under the guidance of a man who had learned to transform pain into purpose. President Traoré visited monthly, always sitting quietly in the back row, listening to lessons that honored both education and reconciliation. The marketplace in Wagadugu became a pilgrimage site for visitors wanting to see where hatred had been transformed into healing through the simple power of human connection. Aisha the fabric seller who had first joined the morning song for Fatima now told the story daily to tourists and journalists who came seeking to understand what they called the miracle of the market. Her stall displayed a framed photograph of that extraordinary day, showing President Traoré kneeling beside Amadu in the dust, surrounded by a crowd transformed from terror to wonder. Local children perform plays about the encounter during school festivals, always emphasizing the moment when a gun was laid down in favor of forgiveness. The grain merchant Bukari had commissioned a small bronze plaque, marking the exact spot where two men chose healing over hatred. The marketplace had become a symbol of hope that resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, inspiring similar acts of reconciliation across West Africa. Amadu's transformation from wanted fugitive to respected educator became a cornerstone of President Traoré's National Reconciliation Program, demonstrating that even the most broken individuals could be restored through compassion and purpose. Former militants and victims of violence attended workshops led jointly by the professor and president, learning practical skills for building peace in their own communities. International observers praised the innovative approach that prioritized healing over punishment while maintaining respect for legal processes and accountability. The program's success attracted funding from across the continent, allowing similar initiatives to spread throughout the Sahel region where conflict had displaced millions. Amadu often spoke at conferences about the day his life changed, always carrying Fatima's photograph and emphasizing how love had proven stronger than revenge. His story became required reading in leadership schools across Africa, studied as an example of how authentic dialogue could bridge even the deepest divisions. The empty pistol from that fateful day was eventually melted down and transformed into a peace bell that now hangs in the courtyard of the Fatima Sankara Memorial School. Every Morning. Students take turns ringing it to begin classes, the clear tone serving as a daily reminder that weapons of destruction can become instruments of hope through human choice and courage. President Traoré and Professor Amadu often stood together listening to that bell, two men forever bonded by a moment, when they chose to see each other's humanity despite every reason to remain enemies. The sound carried across the village and beyond a daily testament to the power of compassion over vengeance and dialogue over violence. Their story continued to inspire new generations of African leaders who understood that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the wisdom to transform them into friends. The bell song became a prayer for peace that echoed across the Sahel, reminding all who heard it that even in the darkest moments, the light of human understanding could always break through. In the heart of Africa, a gun meant for destruction became the catalyst for healing, proving that true leadership transforms enemies into allies through compassion. This incredible story shows how one moment of courage can change everything. What's your take on this powerful encounter? Subscribe and share your thoughts below.